Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical science analyst. And her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show, Irina.
Thanks, and as always, glad to be here.
You're welcome. Welcome. And this we have reached to this 54th episode, 2 years, and it's not a small thing, Irina. Lots of things that I've learned from you, all this. Let's learn straight away go to some big topics. The first one, let's talk about the APEC summit. Uh, Tell us a bit about what happened, the outcome of the APEC summit. What exactly, for a lot of people who have heard about it but have not delved deep into what exactly is this APEC summit all about, and what was the outcome of the recently concluded APEC one?
Well, first, important to note that Prime Minister Modi did not attend the summit. Some are claiming it's due to the potential awkwardness with President Trump. I'm not sure whether that was the only issue, but be it as it may, this was an important gathering. It's an usually happens in a different country in Asia, but in this case, in this case, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit included a very controversial list of issues and events. In some ways, it was the most ideologically fractured gathering in decades, but also in some ways most successful for Washington in terms of projection of influence and achievement of concrete results. One of the big new things about the summit was, of course, the new Japanese Prime Minister entering the fray, and no less important was the fact that on the sidelines of the meetings in South Korea, Trump was also meeting with Xi, the General Secretary of China, and essentially. Essentially, there were several topics on the agenda for Trump that, in some ways, almost defined the summit, but also defined many of the bilaterals that took place between not only Trump, but also and his counterparts in South Korea and other countries, but also between other states and each other. These, of course, included energy security, rare earth investments, and in the discussion of modernization, which would affect both defense and more general supply chains. So essentially, what the White House was hoping to get out of it, and in fact did, was creating a major reciprocal modernization pact with a number of allied countries that could underpin and strengthen its Indo-Pacific strategy. Essentially, a framework that would tie, for instance, Japanese semiconductor exports and rare earth investments to U.S. supply chain guarantees and defense technology sharing. That was a major win-win by both sides. A first and highly successful such a summit and meeting with the U.S. president for the new Japanese prime minister, but of course for the U.S., a major win, opening doors to diversifying its rare earths in light of the tensions with China. Japan, of course, will be getting preferential access to American microchip markets, while also agreeing to a tight embargo on dual-use components that would be otherwise bound for China. So essentially, the dynamic between the two leaders was extremely positive, and many people said that There was a lot of personal touches that made this very successful. The fact that she was a protege of former Prime Minister Abe, who was unfortunately assassinated, and who had enjoyed a very positive personal relationship with President Trump. The gifts that Trump received, the language that was used, and essentially the affirmation of the strong relationship between two countries that in many ways was revived and reinvigorated by by these meetings and also by the summit. Essentially, um, essentially the meeting with Xi too was seen as essentially positive, even though in reality nothing much was changed. Yes, the parties used this opportunity to de-escalate, in that Trump's proposed 100% tariffs were revoked. The two sides agreed to a 1 year cooling off period in which China would lift the restrictions on the U.S. acquisition of certain rare earths, and U.S. Would likewise and would also buy soybeans, which it had previously boycotted. U.S. would likewise not reimpose the tariffs, and in a year from that moment, that relationship would be reevaluated. There were also important discussions with South Korea. Um, for all of the and later on, surprisingly, between China and South Korea and China and Japan. Those are some of the key outcomes from the meeting. It's interesting that in the meeting with his South Korean counterpart, she actually joked gifting him Xiaomi phones produced in China. She joked about a backdoor, basically hinting at a high possibility of espionage, is something that is always concerning whenever using Chinese products, and that China too has also become paranoid about in terms of importing foreign technologies. And with Japan, also the meeting went surprisingly well in an almost relaxed manner, despite the heightened tensions between those two countries in recent past. Essentially, Japan is forced to on the one hand seriously consider defense, its defense future, and with the new leadership, Japan has voluntarily agreed to increase its defense spending to the over 2% that Trump had previously demanded from the NATO members. But on the other hand, it is also looking to continue for trade and economic relations with China, despite the distrust and the geopolitical differences between the two countries. So, this particular gathering, um, on the one hand, reaffirmed the fact U.S. strong relationship with its partners, and its increased reliance on some of the South Korean defense technologies, for instance. But on the other hand, with Trump gone early, it became obvious that she was going to dominate and steal the show, which exactly what happened.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, who was the biggest gainer from this particular summit? Was it the US, Trump especially, or was it China? Was it Japan? Was it South Korea? Who should we understand? We'll come to the India part also after this.
I would say that China did not lose anything from the summit, and in some ways, it was able to project its influence beyond the usual. And quite frankly, a lot of the smaller countries are starting to gravitate to China. But in terms of immediate short-term advantages, US did come away with a lot of, obvious diplomatic wins for Trump. And in some ways, it also reasserted its leadership on some level. It may not be the level that U.S. partners necessarily want, but it is a level that U.S. is willing to give at this time, and it's certainly better than nothing. There's clearly going to be a committed and invested relationship on certain levels in terms of trade, in terms of technology sharing, in terms of rare earth developments with several of the countries in the region, including, by the way, even Cambodia, prior to meeting um, some of the regional leaders. Trump also uh, got um, got a diplomatic win in terms of signing a new, I would say, uh, a strengthened truce commitment between Cambodia and Thailand, but also agreed to rare earth diversification commitments with Cambodia. So in terms of these deepening relationships, that was certainly a major positive development for the U.S. Much, however, will depend on whether U.S. will continue showing up on the defense front, or whether its relationship will be constrained by the balancing act with China, as Trump hinted after the summit. More recently, he pointed to the possibility of the reason his meeting with Xi went so smoothly. He called it a 12 out of 10, was because Trump might have been willing to concede dividing the Asia Pacific region and also the globe in general into US and Chinese sphere of influence, following a very old school Cold War model of diplomatic relations. And I'm not entirely sure that this type of approach will go over well with some of the smaller countries who don't necessarily want to be seen as mere spheres of influence, especially with India, while absent from the summit, in a top level, very much present in on the daily basis.
Absolutely, Irina. Coming to India, he did mention, Trump did mention about India, about Prime Minister Modi, but in the same breath, he also talked about Pakistan. He talked about that, they about Pakistan's prime minister, and then he also talks about the general, that they have a free field marshal and that he is a fighter. What is he trying to give in terms of this sort of messaging, equating Pakistan, putting them all together, balancing Pakistan's political leadership with the military leadership, and then also putting it all together? What is he trying to tell here? And he also brings about the 250% tariff also earlier on when there was this India Pakistan conflict. Help us understand that here his mind on this. What is he trying to play here?
I think Trump, there are several things going on. On the one hand, Trump is sort of looking to get back into Pakistan from an economic standpoint. He is seeing all the Gulf states rushing after assorted project proposals, economic corridors, connectivity, and he wants to get in on the action and to profit from it financially. On the other hand, he has repeatedly in the last couple of weeks has used Pakistan as an example of a country testing nuclear weapons. And I think it's less about really what Pakistan is or isn't doing, but more about essentially Trump finding a basis um, to back up his recent decision to start open nuclear tests again from the U.S. perspective. Now, the official story is that the Russian testing of Burevestnik and Poseidon weapons, um, a submarine nuclear weapon, for instance, were the proximate causes that prompted his decision, not to mention Chinese nuclear rearmament or continued armament in the background. And it's not anything specific that Pakistan necessarily did recently, although that concern is always there and has been there, especially as a concern for India for a very long time. But it's also about the need to sort of reassert the U.S. Right to do that by pointing out all the other nuclear actors that exist with varying degrees of responsibility and accountability, and basically to show that U.S. cannot afford to be seen as falling behind or unable to actively respond to regional nuclear threats wherever they come from. So I think Pakistan was more of an illustration and less of any practical policy line that Trump is currently pushing, and it was not so much about U.S.-Pakistan relations as more of an example of why U.S. is going to be changing course on this particular issue.
Absolutely. So, if Trump is so thinking about Pakistan, then why is he letting this Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict going on? There is a talk of, peace talks, and there might be some sort of a breakthrough. But I want to understand, if he can stop India-Pakistan war, he can certainly stop this conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Just one call, and everything will be quiet as it was long time back.
Well, yes and no. First of all, Pakistan and India, for all their tensions, are still largely conventional state actors. Pakistan may be very much divided internally, but nevertheless, it has been around for a few decades. It's not a new entity. Taliban, on the other hand, is trying to gain acknowledgement as a newly constituted state actor with varying degrees of access to governance in the past, but for the first time taking full control and attempting to gain international recognition. Um, so, first of all, the nature of the conflicts is different. The nature of the conflicting parties is different, and the nature of what Trump calls wars is also different, because the brief conflagration and engagement between India and Pakistan, some people would um, call an escalation, but probably not a full blown and long term war. And in that there were no clear ultimate outcomes. Yes, India ultimately caused damage to particular structures that we used for as basis for extremism and as a threat in the general direction of Kashmir. But at the end of the day, was the was there any significant reevaluation of borders or any major long-term agreements that came out of this uh, escalation and its consequent resolution? No, it's almost like a pause, a very prolonged and durable pause, but nevertheless, the underlying issues have not been resolved. Still, some may argue that the escalation itself was either a trial run or just a limited operation that was never meant to be anything more than an asymmetrical attack, not necessarily Pakistan was not necessarily looking to get into a long-term conflict. What we're seeing between Afghanistan and Pakistan is altogether different, not only because there are long-term and different issues involved. Demarcation of borders that has not been ever fully resolved and remained in dispute through various changes of government in Afghanistan. Also, the spread of different groups, some of which Pakistan has at various points considered terrorist, and other points in other groups from the same general background that it has backed. And we are talking about the Afghan Taliban as opposed to the TTP, their exact tribal counterparts, which inhabit Pakistan, and some of which migrated into Afghanistan to escape counterterrorism operations and joined up with their Afghan counterparts. The most basic issue, however, is that the Taliban is not going to moderate ideologically. It's a fundamentalist Islamist group that has no intention of changing. It has no. It may modernize its methods. It may modernize its engagement and diplomacy, but it's not changing its ultimate ideology. Is certainly not changing its objectives in the region, and its main objective is to challenge governments that do not live up to its model of what an Islamic state should look like, and it's starting to impress on Pakistan that it is not controllable at the end of the day. The Pakistani ISI used the Mujahideen as an asset during the Cold War. They certainly cultivated them vis-a-vis um, other regional players in recent years. But now the Taliban has gotten more or less official power. It is looking for more international recognition in more ways than one. Not only as a state actor seeking a UN international community approval, but also recognition from other Islamist groups. And it is getting that sort of recognition and support, which may supplant the sort of more generic international and global support Afghanistan needs for economic reasons. Essentially, for the time being, it's in both parties' interest to contain that conflict, which was getting out of hand. But it is seen, but Taliban feels that it is winning this conflict. Pakistan is grappling with the spiraling violence in parts of the country, including in Balochistan. Its civil-military relationship is fraying. Um, Taliban is confronting, on the one hand, a collapsing economy, and it's being challenged by the groups. And it's Taliban is not a single group either; it's a gathering of different, essentially, different Pashtun entities with the same agenda but conflicting tribal and internal ideological power objectives. It's also facing donor fatigue after numerous internal and external disasters. Its mismanagement of climatic events and proliferating threat from ISIS-K, which is sometimes an ally and sometimes a challenger. So, what we are talking about when we're discussing confidence building measures in the framework of these peace discussions is crisis management, trying to stop the bleeding along the Duran line while avoiding addressing the structural pathologies that produced the current situation. And the reality is that Taliban has no intention of ultimately stopping. It is encroaching into Pakistan, and it feels it can pressure the Pakistani authorities sufficiently to gain significant ground internally. Now, the Pakistan security establishment is looking for a couple of things out of this arrangement, which it may not say out loud and in public, but which are nevertheless existential from its perspective. First, it wants the Afghan Taliban to produce verifiable constraints on TTP operations from Afghan soil. Um, and the second, it wants to preserve coercive leverage over cross border trade that keeps Kabul dependent on Pakistani goodwill economically. So, what that would look like in practice is joint patrols, hot pursuit understandings, relocation of specific TTP commanders away from tribal belts that are contiguous with Pakistan's territory. Taliban is ready to offer language about non-interference, which is in some ways completely non-committal, but it will refuse and reject anything that looks like a precedent for granting external actors police powers inside Afghanistan, which is kind of what Pakistan has done in the past and what it's looking to continue to do in the future. But the Taliban, fueled by this wave of Islamist support from around the world, feels that it may not necessarily want or need Pakistan's patronage in the same form any longer. It may not be able to count on 100% backing from countries like Turkey and Qatar because they too have economic interests and they don't want and they want the Taliban, you know, asserting limited control. But on the other hand, at the same time, um, Afghanistan understands that it is getting some specific leverage on the ground, that Pakistan in some ways has been dealt a blow. The fact that they have to negotiate with their former asset is a humiliation in some ways and an admission of weaknesses, and its political structure has proved to be vulnerable and it's infiltratable, to use that word, something that people are not really ready to acknowledge. The fact that the Taliban may not have full sophistication of the ISI doesn't mean that they can't or won't get there, that they can't co-opt certain entities to join them, at least politically, and that they can't exert their influence inside not only Pakistan territorially through conflicts, through infiltration, through tribal attacks, but also that it can't put pressure inside its political apparatus, its security apparatus, by coming to deals with the more extreme or corrupted elements inside it. So we are seeing a very complicated picture emerge, and um, the Taliban has some leverage. It doesn't have as much leverage as Pakistan, which is in a better economic and structural position and is obviously largely a recognized state. But it does have the advantage of having more Islamist support around the world. They hold up the Taliban as an example of that perfect, almost quasi caliphate, something that ISIS, for instance, has never been able to fully achieve and hold on to. And Pakistan um, seems unstable and corrupt and imperfect by extension, with a lot of secular or semi secular elements. Um, uh, uh, in it, and also unable to define its direction, with different factions fighting one another. Whereas, while the Taliban is also not unified, despite these internal differences and power struggles, the general direction of fundamentalist Islam is very much clearly defined.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So coming back to India, US, uh, how should we understand where is this whole thing going? Several levels talks are going on. Trump keeps on mentioning about India, about Prime Minister Modi. Then there is this, trade talks are on, and amidst all the discord with tariffs and all, there is the US has signed a 10-year defense pact with India. How does this whole scenario look like? Are India, Pakistan, friends, not friends, or it's complicated? Where what it is all about?
Well, I don't see any love lost between India and Pakistan at the moment. And also, but at the same time, India is benefiting between the current escalation between the Taliban and Pakistan. Anything that gets Pakistan weakened and distracted from pursuing its own goals in trying to destabilize India obviously is beneficial to New Delhi. Clearly, you know. Uh, Trump too is trying to balance different interests. He clearly sees India as a major player in the region and a major linchpin to his Indo-Pacific strategy. But for the time being, the Indo-Pacific strategy seems to have been um, set aside from his more tactical effort to regain some sort of a balance in his relationship with China. He is trying to sort of shame Pakistan on the nuclear front while simultaneously pursuing internal economic interests. He is interested in potentially settling things between the Taliban and Pakistan, but it's not also a top priority because let's face it, the Taliban is clearly not an ally, even if Pakistan at various points was considered to be, and I don't think even Trump will consider the Taliban an ally. So some level of instability there also benefits him, though he's always happy to take credit or to attempt to moderate. But the major players in the Afghanistan and Pakistan talks are really Saudi Arabia, Turkey, some of the other countries, UAE at various points in times. It's not US. Um, Now, what's happening with India is, of course, there's been an outreach from the Taliban towards India to and a visit. I think we are very far from full normalization. I think India may try to turn the Taliban into its own asset vis-a-vis Pakistan, at least temporarily, and to provide some backing just to keep Pakistan destabilized. I don't know if a completely unstable Pakistan that's in the hands of the Taliban is in India's interest, because as soon as the Taliban reaches that point where they have more control than not inside Pakistan, it will be an even worse version of Pakistan, but with nuclear weapons potentially. Not something that India wants to see. So that balancing act is going to be quite difficult, I'm afraid, and I'm not sure that everyone is fully ready to admit that this is a very tricky game to play. Unfortunately, whereas all of that could have been solved rather easily if India and the US were acting as a united security front of countering Islamist extremism and viewed Pakistan and Taliban as part of the same problem rather than playing these local games. This is not currently the case. The tariff conflict is putting a major strain on the relationship, so much so that despite these ongoing negotiations, so far very little has been achieved. Trump's, on the one hand, is sort of praising Prime Minister Modi for being tough, a tough player, something that he unquestionably respects. But on the other hand, um, there is some unrelated to Trump personally internal dynamics in the US that I think making it even more challenging to achieve results. We have heard some comments about J.D. Vance and his wife that have ruffled a lot of feathers concerning cultural and religious elements. Um, the fact that it's his personal um, issue is actually much part of a larger point. The fact that J.D. Vance has failed to use this opportunity to essentially assert the importance of the Indian American community to the U.S. as a vice president rather than simply addressing this matter as a husband. That I think has drawn a lot of concerns, more than anyone cares to admit. And the incident with the assorted Stalinist Nazis and so forth, who essentially insulted J.D. Vance's wife and children, and basically spreading racism on social media. That too, I think, is raising a lot of concern about where the U.S. politics is headed in general, and the fact that the Republican Party which is currently in power, is being infiltrated by such increasingly visible elements, I think, is causing a lot of concern and constraint on the Indian side, even if it's not part of the official formal negotiations and talks. And I'm not sure that even lifting the tariffs would solve all the problems at this point. I think there's there are these undertones behind these seemingly economic discussions that are adding to the fraying relations. And unless there's a very clear change in tone in the very near future, I think it will actually keep getting worse.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. We'll come to this part of the world once again, but before that, let's go to Sudan. How should we understand about all this, genocide, if we may call it, going on? Should we understand that the world doesn't want to talk about it, or should we understand that the world is talking about it, but people are not listening to it or are not interested? What's going on in Sudan? How would you like us to understand about Sudan and the so-called genocide that's happening?
Well, there's been an ongoing civil war since, for the last couple of years. And there's been a number of massacres over this time that were clearly related to the sectarian and racial nature of some of the internal dynamics. The bottom, the overall conflict is not over tribal or sectarian issues, it's about power between the two warlords that essentially want to unify the country under their own rule. And in order to get to power, they were willing to polarize the country along those lines. But on top of that, you have various external players trying to use these various factions to address their own interests and concerns, and fellow travelers and allies of these two warlords who are complicating the landscape. Um, this The SAF, under uh, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has essentially joined forces with some of the Muslim Brotherhood and ex-Bashir elements. They've also received assistance from Iran, but they also are largely backed by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Um, and even Qatar. The Rapid Support Forces, the former Janjaweed, basically, the non-religious but highly tribal, very violent militias that we unified under Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, have been are backed by Russia, UAE, Chad, and other external African mercenary groups. And they have had an interest in consolidating natural resources such as gold, um, and they have also been the ones n- most known for systematic campaign of ethnic annihilation in Darfur and Kordofan regions. Not to say that the SAF has not caused horrendous civilian damage, including indiscriminate shelling of civilians, contributing to the artificial famine plaguing the country and keeping the civilians from getting the international humanitarian assistance. All of that is very true, but it seems that the RSF have actually been targeting assorted groups, basically black groups living in Darfur and Kordofan, for these massacres. And what recently raised the profile of this ongoing and horrific uh, conflict that's been described as the worst humanitarian disaster in the world was the massacre of over 400 civilians in a hospital in Al Fasher in Sudan. As RSF, which has also formed an informal parallel government, um, has advanced into that area. There's a couple of things that caused the attention to shift. First, the nature of massacring patients and civilians in the hospital is generally horrific, and it was extremely large scale and graphic and well documented. And at the same time, the situation with Gaza has taken sort of a back. It faded a bit into a background while the ceasefire is holding and while Hamas is returning the bodies of the hostages to Israel. While all of that is going on, the countries that were largely focused on Gaza are now starting to focus on Sudan. Not that there hasn't been any diplomatic efforts in Sudan. There have been. Saudi Arabia and other countries have tried to mediate at various points in time, but these recent events have shifted the calculus, and there's also been a recent attempted mediated effort in the United States where various parties try to come together to come up with a political solution. But as we are seeing, nothing has come of this. There's been what's drawing people's attention is that there is a convergence of three different forces: the collapse of central authority, the return of ethnically motivated warfare as opposed to generalized, horrible, bloodthirsty, but still just generic warfare, and the growing indifference of the international community, which was distracted by crisis in Ukraine, formerly Gaza, now also the tensions in the Pacific. Now, what what many people agree on, many observers, is that the atrocities in Darfur in particular are not spontaneous eruptions of violence, but organized and deliberate acts of demographic engineering. There's been examples of satellite imagery, eyewitness reports, intercepted communications which indicate the existence of RSF cleansing zones designed to eliminate non-Arab populations through forced displacement, sexual violence, and starvation. So these methods very much mirror the predecessor of RSF, the Janjaweed, which took place in the early 2000s. And back then, the idealistic college students in the West marched in favor of Darfur and drawing attention to Darfur, and nothing came out of it. obviously, and that has long since been forgotten. But this time, what we're seeing is far more sophisticated. It's coordinated through encrypted channels, it's financed through gold smuggling routes that go all the way to Libya, Chad, and even tracked to the UAE, and are politically shielded by regional patrons who view Sudan's fragmentation as a strategic buffer against each other's ambitions and threats. The rhetoric of genocide was in the early stages of the war was avoided. First of all, there was not enough evidence that it was systematic or sectarian based. It seemed to be the mass killing seemed to be a general byproduct of a horrific war, but nothing more than that. Now that's changing and entering the diplomatic mainstream. The US officials are starting to concede that the scale and coordination of the RSF's campaign in West Darfur meets the threshold of genocidal intent under the international legal definitions. The Trump administration has been hesitant to make formal declaration. Trump's foreign policy team is, first of all, skeletal. Second, it's uh, uh, mostly comprised of realists and isolationists rather than interventionalists, and view Sudan less as a moral crisis and more as a theater of regional competition between different powers and the potential to create major refugee crisis and a major security problem in the region. Um, uh, for Washington, condemning genocide without a plan for intervention risks being accused of moral posturing without any strategic payoff. And U.S. has to also be careful to not alienate any of its allies that may be involved on one or the other of the sides. Essentially, the Trump administration has shifted from the concept of responsibility to protect to concept of responsibility to stabilize, which basically um, advocates intervention only to prevent mass migration or terrorist spillover, not so much by moral imperatives. Sudan has failed both tests of political urgency. It lacks the immediate migratory impact of Syria because most of the Sudanese who fled the country have settled in nearby African countries and therefore do not concern Europe or the United States as much. And the US has blocked refugees, except from some white refugees from South Africa anyway. And also, it does not have the strategic weight of the Red Sea shipping lanes the way Somalia and Yemen do. As a result, U.S. is unlikely to intervene in through anything more than sanctions and intelligence sharing with Egypt and UAE, who are backing opposing sides in the conflict. The war, nevertheless, is not containable. The displacement crisis has reached nearly 12 million. And these refugee flows are destabilizing Chad and South Sudan, which is suffering from its own internal political problems. The humanitarian collapse is now so severe that even the transitional government in South Sudan, which was at one point dependent on Sudan's oil pipelines and still has not resolved all of its issues with Sudan over that, has actually turned to Russia and China for logistical support. Regional actors are trying to fill the void that's left by Western paralysis. UAE stands accused of funneling money and arms to Hemeti's forces under the pretext of tribal reconciliation, while Egypt is believed to be providing tactical intelligence and air support to the SAF. The Horn of Africa has become essentially a proxy chessboard, while with everyone, externally denying involvement but openly reaping the benefits of the ensuing chaos. The RSF is consolidating power in Darfur and is basically transforming itself from a paramilitary faction into a parallel state. I already mentioned that they've announced a new government. It's controlling gold mines, it's controlling border routes, and that gives it some level of financial autonomy. It's using effective propaganda machine to call its campaign a war of Arab liberation against a perceived African encroachment. Using this ethno-nationalist narrative, which was once confined to very local grievances, and it's now spreading through social media operations, amplifying rhetoric of racial supremacy and Islamic revivalism. So, whereas previously RSF was seen as very much secular, very much anti-Muslim Brotherhood in its approach, and it has criticized SAF on these Islamist grounds. Now that's changing, and now they are appealing to Islamist interests in order to essentially gain control. So now we are not seeing just another civil war, but also an ideological revival of the darkest moments of their fourth previous military campaigns, turbocharged by modern technologies. And on the other hand, also the accusation of genocide has become weaponized inside the elites. Burhan's forces use the term to rally international sympathy and to legitimize their own in-battle status as the national army. Hemeti supporters counter with claims that Burhan's airstrikes are in themselves war crimes. Each side is using atrocities, but is willing to sacrifice some level of legitimacy, knowing that the international attention span for nuance is very short. And the UN is hamstrung by veto politics, by donor fatigue, and by general sense of ineffectualness. And as many have said, is becoming an observer to its own irrelevance in stopping this horrific situation.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. We'll keep on touching Sudan whenever we discuss and understand what's going on in that part of the world. Coming back to the US, what's happening with the anti Semitism row breaking out in US, dividing MAGA over Tucker, Fuentes, and Heritage So Foundation. So help us understand what's going on in there. Why is it making so much of news in that part? And we talked about Gaza also. Everything seems to be quiet, but not quite in Israel. There is upheaval. Israel Hamas skirmishes are on, but then there is anti-draft bill rallies, government efforts to block Bennett from running in 2026 elections. What is happening in Israel? I thought things are quiet everywhere. It will be quiet. Peace will prevail. Help us understand from that part. I mean, it's all these things. Hamas is lobbying hard to have sanctions removed in Australia.
Yeah, the situation is complicated. In the US, anti-Semitism has been rising on the left and on the right for quite some time. And it's not just anti-Semitism, it's bigotry, it's all sort of extreme politics, extreme levels of intolerance and bigotry. In New York City, today, Mamdani won the election. He has been accused of being outright anti-Semitic and supporting extremist factions. Of having extremely socialist politics. He actually comes from a democratic socialist wing. He's not a mainstream democratic candidate, yet he managed to win the primaries and secure the overall the democratic support. He has been accused of also co-opting extreme factions in the Jewish, Muslim, and other communities that are willing to go along with him for various political reasons, including some of them actually supporting his ideology, but while alienating the mainstream interests of those populations and demographics. And he is viewed with extreme concern by various minorities and ethnic groups in the city because he's seen as a populist divider, not as a uniter who will push against sectarianism and unify the people. He essentially is has even suggested taxing white people at a different rate than everybody else, and that in itself breeds resentment. It's absolutely illegal and unconstitutional, and it also invites essentially invites a creation of grievance hierarchies that never serve anybody well and have backfired tremendously in the past. On the right, you have Tucker Carlson pushing the so-called woke right, the grievance politics-based equivalent of the right, into an outright conspiratorial and racist direction. Most recently, he gained notoriety by hosting Nicolas Fuentes, a white supremacist, pro-Hitler, pro-Stalin, um, very young individual who has been essentially, on the one hand, being mainstreamed by social media and by his infamous dinner with Trump a few years back, but on the other hand, has been also gaining a lot of support from assorted MAGA personalities that are trying to push more isolationist and big tent view of right-wing politics. And not all of them necessarily share all of Fuentes' views, but are willing to accept him so long as his base of support provides some level of buffering from the left. Now, as I said, ironically, the same individual essentially embraces extreme leftist economic policies, something that should be anathema to the right wing, but nevertheless, here we are. Now, all of that blew up, not just with the interview itself, where Fuentes literally called for killing Jews or expelling them, not just Jews in the United States, by the way, but killing them everywhere in the future. But also the head of the Heritage Foundation, which was Ronald Reagan's think tank, and it's especially a pipeline of ideas to the influential Republican working group in the House. He came out in support of Tucker Carlson. He called the critics of Tucker, who supposedly want to cancel him, a venomous coalition. Essentially, just as Tucker Carlson simultaneously attacked Christian Zionists like Senator Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee by name, and essentially he gave his full support to Tucker, which caused a major blow up in the anti-Semitism task force, which Heritage has put out. And as it turned out, many of the groups and individuals who were allegedly part of the task force never had agreed to participate in it. They were merely listed by the organization without their consent. A lot of particularly Jewish members of the task force ended up resigning in protest. None of that resolved the problem. While Roberts issued a partial apology, he never backed away from his support of Tucker Carlson, nor has he clearly condemned the general direction, nor has he clarified the direction of Heritage, which remains one of the most influential conservative think tanks in Washington. Moreover, some of the staffers with Jewish names who left the organization, the various other organizations received a letter from one of the remaining staffers who basically called these individuals who left deceitful and treacherous, and essentially told those other organizations and media not to listen to them and not to hire them. So essentially, the Heritage Foundation and its partners are calling for cancellation of mostly Jewish staffers who left. All of this is causing an extreme level of polarization within the Republican Party on all levels. There was a major Republican Jewish coalition gathering over the weekend, where obviously some of those Christian Zionists that Tucker condemned were present, and on the other hand, some of the Jewish Republicans attempted to back Tucker and his right to host whomever he wishes to engage in debate. There is a controversy over the Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, being taken over by the J.D. Vance Tucker Carlson coalition. There's the criticism of J.D. Vance himself, who, as part of the his commitment to continue Kirk's legacy, went to the University of Mississippi to engage with conservative students. And when asked about Israel and whether Israel is manipulating U.S. foreign policy. Basically, instead of saying that that has never happened, or essentially calling out the anti-Semitic commitment of such comments, said that Trump is the first president in U.S. history not to be manipulated by Israel and presumably others. So that has left a lot of people very confused about the U.S. vice president in engaging in extracurricular activities and also not pushing back against conspiracy theories and double standards. Then you had, on top of this, Nick Waters came out attacking J.D. Vance's wife and children on the basis of the Indian background, and all of that has caused a tremendous split. Because, in fact, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, Fuentes has actually praised J.D. Vance and considered him, Tucker, himself, and a couple of other people as basically the future of the party. So essentially, despite his personal attacks on Vance and his family, he does consider them fellow travelers or allies, ideological allies, who would be willing to continue his line as opposed to a more traditional Republican conservative line, which was always anti any sort of discriminatory attitude towards anybody. So we are seeing the party being literally torn apart with these narratives, and on the left you have the same thing happening with the democratic socialists taking over and galvanizing the party. Two of its most dynamic and younger members, Zohran Mamdani in New York and Alexander in Congress, are considered to be future national leaders. Mamdani can't run for president, but he can hold other national offices and to exercise a great deal of party influence. And AOC is certainly considering a run in 2028. So these developments are creating this huge concern over anti-Semitism, but also about the general direction of the country and of the two parties. While Israel is looming in the background, the activities may have the open confrontation may have subsided, although it has not fully been eliminated. But Hamas is reasserting itself in Gaza without a question. Turkey is looking to get in on the action as part of the stabilization force US is pushing for 2 years. Israel is rejecting Turkish participation in those forces, while US is pushing for its inclusion, which creates a level of uncertainty about the future of the task force that nobody else seems to want to join. There are some Pakistani, Indonesian, and Azerbaijani peacekeepers or forces that are willing to participate, but if Hamas fully takes over Gaza, I'm not entirely sure what these forces will be able to do and what their actual objective is going to be. Are they coming in only once Hamas is fully resigned from power? Are they there to help dislodge Hamas? There's no clear answer to these questions because, as I said, Turkey is claiming that Hamas is ready to leave. Hamas is claiming exactly the opposite. Everyone is acting as if Hamas has de facto committed to leaving. Meanwhile, civilians in Gaza are being tortured and executed in broad daylight. The situation is far from clear, and Hamas is using this opportunity of being de facto a reconstituted political entity to push for a removal of the sanctions designation in Australia and claiming that it's the government of Gaza, that it has the support of the population, which, by the way, is once again rising because many Gazans are, first of all, skeptical about Trump's plan, and second, are seeing that they're regaining support for the resistance narrative. I don't think this narrative is likely to succeed, and certainly not in the near future. But I think Hamas is trying to gain a popular victory of the opinion on the streets in Australia by at least making this case an argument.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Lots of things happening in the world, and every 2 weeks we'll keep coming to you and make sense to make sense of what's all happening. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Shukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.